In this video, I'm going to review the Image Apply Image feature of Photoshop that allows for image blending in some advanced and powerful ways. Specifically, I'll review how we can use this feature for frequency separation, for more advanced skin retouching and airbrushing effects. We'll take this photo, which I found on Unsplash, and which is a nice shot, and attempt to prepare it as if the shot was intended for a magazine cover. Such images are rarely, if ever, untouched by Photoshop retouching experts who can apply airbrushing effects and digital makeup in ways that perhaps set an unrealistic standard of beauty. So I think that there are certainly ethical arguments to be made about how far images should be retouched. Nevertheless, the techniques that they apply are useful to learn, and we are going to explore them here and attempt to transform this image into more of a glamour shot. To do this, we'll separate the skin tone from the skin texture using a technique called frequency separation. We'll also explore the tonal range and lighting of the photo to soften the light with a diffuse glow and enhance the sense that this might have been airbrushed, for example. Let's get started with it. So I always like to start by making a copy of the background layer, which I've already done here. And I can throw that away. You can make a copy of the background layer by dragging it to the plus in your layers panel or hitting the Control J or Command J key on your keyboard in order to make a duplicate copy. Now, often I'll start with an image by taking a look at the tonal range, and I can just look at this and feel like it might be slightly flat. Like I don't see necessarily a pure black in this. It feels like kind of a gray there, even in the darkest areas where I'm losing texture. So we could validate that by taking a look at the levels, and sure enough, I'm not getting anything that's really pure white or pure black in the spectrum. I could try and improve the contrast by adjusting my levels, but I'm going to do that in some different ways. One of the things that I'll sometimes do with an image is actually apply contrast through blend modes as well. So for example, I could apply a soft light blend mode, which would immediately up the contrast by just simply putting the image on itself, right, with one of the layers having a soft light blend mode. I wouldn't even really need these layer copies in order to do that. With one of the features of Photoshop, specifically the apply image feature, one thing that I could do is actually choose that option, and with my background layer simply say that I want to apply the soft light filter, for example, and I don't even need two layers. I'm simply applying soft light to the same image on itself. And I could take the opacity down if that was like too much, maybe too much contrast. I could bring that down. We could see the difference though that just a little bit of that soft light effect might make on that image. So with apply image, we can apply, really blend two things together, or even one image on itself. And so we'll see some advanced use cases of that in just one second. I might come back to this idea of applying soft light in order to have some diffuse light effects. So for example, one of the things that I'll sometimes do is take this, bring a layer on top, and decide that I want to blur that top layer. I'll apply a Gaussian blur in this case, and some level of blur on the skin tone. I'm going to bring this up to maybe 8 point, maybe about 10. So a lot of blur in that case. But what I could do is apply that back to the image using some soft light, and we get this really sort of softer light effect because of the diffuse glow of the blurred image. And so I'll apply that and mitigate the effect by taking the opacity down here. So I could both sort of up the contrast of this image if I felt like it was a little bit flat, and give it a little bit more of a diffuse kind of lighting sense, just with that applying sort of this blur to that. And I might choose to do that for this image. Before I begin with that though, let's go ahead and actually do our frequency separation. One of the things that is true on images, if you're trying to fix blemishes and things, and so if I was preparing this for a magazine, I might look at places where the skin tone isn't exactly perfect, or the skin is a little bit bumpier than I wanted, or maybe there's some blemishes and things that I want to remove, such as a mole or something like that. And if we were preparing this for a magazine, that would be pretty commonly done, right? You really don't see magazine covers out there that aren't manipulated, and sometimes in really unrealistic ways. Nevertheless, the key to good Photoshop is subtlety. And so one of the things that people used to do for preparing these types of things is they would literally just blur the skin out. And they would keep the sharpness of the eyes and the edges of the nose and the mouth and simply blur the skin. And it would make the skin all really, really soft. The problem with that is it can quickly get a little bit unrealistic and look just a bit weird. Our focus tends to be on the things that are in focus and eyes and things like that, so it is a bit confusing to the eye. Nevertheless, it's unrealistic that someone wouldn't have any skin tone, like any skin texture, I should say. So I want to keep that skin texture there. Often what makes the sort of look of it not so much, it's not really so much about the skin texture, but really the tone behind. So if you have a blemish on your face, the way that the lighting will cast, it will cast some shadow or some highlights in places that sort of call attention to that. And we could smooth out that skin tone while like keeping the texture. We'll do that with frequency separation. And again, we need to start with creating copies of the background layer like I had done before, but then deleted. I'm going to go ahead and hit Control J for this second one. And we've got two copies. So one of them is going to be for the texture. So I'm going to name that the texture layer. And the other one is going to be for the tone. I'll name that the tone layer. And the tone is underneath the texture in this case. Now first I'm going to turn off the texture layer and we'll explore some frequency separation via this, by making this tone layer sort of blurrier to start with. So we're going to use the filter effect on the tone layer itself. And I'm going to use a Gaussian blur. And I'm going to recommend a setting of maybe about 6 right here for this particular image to blur this out a little bit. Like we're going to get a little bit of a blur. And what we're going to be able to do is differentiate what's blurry from what's really in focus within the image, the sort of harder lines and edges of this. To do that, I'm going to turn the texture layer back on, make sure that that layer is now selected, and we're going to go to our image, apply image feature. Now, under apply image, one of the things that is available to us that isn't available in traditional blend modes is this add and subtract features. And we're going to go to the subtract feature of this. Instead of choosing the merged as the source here, meaning that all of the layers are merged together, we're going to actually choose the tone layer. And so we're going to subtract really the tone layer from the texture layer in this case. And the settings here become really important. The offset really is how light or dark this is, and so 128 is sort of the very middle gray, and that's exactly what we want. You'll notice if we have that at 0, it would be very dark. If we had it at 255, it would be very light. But we can see that we're still pulling out some of the harder lines and textures there. The edges are kind of being subtracted from the blurry background as we're comparing these two images together. We're keeping a lot of the tone, but the texture we can sort of be able to find. The scale here can go from 0 to 2 in terms of the scale. I'm sorry, from 1 to 2. And so we could put different scales in here and get differing effects as to what that's going to look like. But generally, the recommended values here are going to be 2 in terms of the scale and 128 in terms of the offset to get a kind of perfect gray here, and we'll keep all of these particular settings. Once I click OK, that texture layer now has been transformed into this sort of gray layer that has all of the skin textures on it. We can apply that back to our tone layer that is blurry, but we can apply it back through the blend mode of linear light. So I'm going to go ahead and choose that linear light, and in the end our image looks pretty much exactly the same as it did in the beginning. Like if I look at just the background image compared to the rest of that, by alt clicking on the eye I can isolate that image, and then we could see that that's exactly the same. But now I've separated really the texture that's here right from the tone that's underneath, and we're going to be able to work on those layers separately, which is really, really powerful. So that's called frequency separation, what we've just done here. We're able to take some of those textural elements, keep them on one layer, and more of the shadow and tone elements on a different layer. So now what we'll do is we'll go to that tone layer, and we're going to blur out aspects of the skin tone. So if we see an area that has some blemish, what you can do is go to your selection tools here. So I'm going to choose my lasso tool. I'm going to make sure that that lasso tool has some feathering on it. I've got 20 pixels of feathering right now, and that should be enough. And that will give that a soft edge. And so I'll make a selection of the area that I want to improve the skin tone on. So maybe right here. I might go over to my quick mask mode by clicking on that button to make sure I'm getting a kind of soft edge and I'm not bleeding into areas that I don't want to see. You can hit Q on your keyboard or this little button for the quick mask mode to get a visualization of what area you'll be affecting. And you want to make sure that that has a relatively nice, smooth, sort of feathered or soft edge, so that there's no hard line there when we blur this out. Then what we'll do is we'll go on our tone layer and add some additional blurring to the skin tone, which will average out the skin tone within that area. And so we can really take the tones from all over the place, kind of apply them to the areas that had more sort of, shadow or darkness or sort of, other color to them that maybe we didn't quite want. We'll go to our filter effect. Again, I'm going to be choosing Gaussian blur. And this time I'm going to up the blur level quite a bit. I'm going to bring that up, and you can see as I do that a lot of the skin tone is starting to smooth out. You can't push this too far, otherwise you'll end up getting, obviously some negative effects there. So we don't want to overdo that, but I'm going to actually push the blurring of that area out quite a bit. And so I can blur and sort of average out the skin tone. What's nice here is we're keeping the textures of the skin because they're really separated on their own frequency layer. So I'm going to bring this up maybe into the 20-25 range or something, really quite blurring that area. And we can click OK, and we could really take a look at the difference here between having that sort of blurred in terms of the skin tone and what we got before. And we can choose just varying areas to do that. So if there's other areas where we feel like maybe the skin tone gets a little bumpy or a little weird, we might select that area, take a look at what we're going to be using here, and then going to our blur effects, Gaussian blur. And you don't always need to use the same settings, right? So in some areas I might want more blur, and in others, I might want a little bit less and just sort of less of an effect. So we could see that effect being applied as we change these numbers around, and I might only choose maybe about 20 on this particular one. And we can see the preview of what's happening as that skin tone kind of is more averaged out as we do this. And I can click OK when that seems to work for me. And I might just go around this image, choosing different places where we might improve the skin tone. I like to, kind of make sure that I'm not bleeding off of any particular edge or hitting edges that I don't want in that case. And we'll go through this and use the Gaussian blur feature on the tone layer and try different blurring effects to see, what sort of works for that particular area. And it doesn't always have to be the same, but we can see that we can smooth out some of that skin tone in varying ways. I might choose about 18 for this one and see how that effect kind of happens in there. And let's go ahead and sort of do that in a few other places. I might do that a little bit here on the nose, along here, and just sort of see how that works along that area. Filter, blur, Gaussian blur. I'm going to bring this down just a bit, maybe 15 on the nose, and let's see the difference there that some of that smoothing makes. Takes that shadow over a little bit more, makes the shadow a little less distinct on that edge. So we got to be a little bit careful what we're doing with the shadows. I think that probably looks okay. And I'm going to go ahead and make some other selection here. So we can go maybe into this skin tone right here and smooth that out just a little bit as well. I'll go to my filter effects and continue to do this. So blur, Gaussian blur, and bringing that down a little bit, we can see some of the difference in what happens with our skin tones here as we sort of smooth those out. So we can continue to do that on any of the areas of the face where we feel like we might have a little bit of issue in terms of the skin tone, but we can really see the difference here between what we're doing and we're still keeping some realism. We're not losing any of the skin texture really, and so we're just kind of smoothing out the tones here, which has a pretty big impact on the look and feel of this particular image. All right, from here we can actually go to the texture layer if there's any pieces that we wanted to clean up with cloning. So for example, on the eye, if I wanted to remove that little sort of mole that was there, we could do that with our clone tool. And one of the nice things about this, if we just look at the texture layer, I don't really have to worry about matching the tone. The tone's underneath, so this is all pretty gray. And so what I want to do is just sort of match the skin texture, and I'll make a sample holding down the Alt or Option key. I'll sample with my clone tool. I can go over that area. I want to make sure that I have a soft edge brush as I do this, but I can sort of paint over that particular area and get rid of that mole. If I turn the tone back on, we can kind of see the difference here, where that mole was and what we've done with that. And we could do that in any other areas of this. If there's particular, let's say that there's more of an indent there on the nose, sort of a little mark there that we wanted to smooth out, that's part of the texture there. I might actually select some other skin texture and go over the nose and kind of smooth that out in a couple places where maybe there's some marks that are a little bit bigger. I want to keep most of that skin tone in there, but if there's a couple places where I felt like the skin texture could improve just a little bit more, I could certainly clone and sample those things out. I don't necessarily like to get rid of moles and things that are a real part of somebody's face. I don't necessarily want to get rid of that because I think that that's sort of part of the identity there. So I'm not going to necessarily remove everything, but if there was little blemishes on the face that we'd want to maybe get rid of for the sake of a more glamour shot, or maybe your client is like, hey, can you get rid of this blemish that I had on my face? I like the picture otherwise. You'd be able to really do that in a realistic way, a more subtle way, where we still have nice kind of skin, where the skin texture is still there, but we've smoothed out a lot of the tone. So we can see some of the difference that we're making as we do this, but still some level of realism in that particular photo. Awesome. So if you like what you got, we could move on from there. One of the things I like to do is sometimes just create a stamp of my imagery by, you could literally just, merge these layers together and then they become one. But maybe I want to come back to this if I feel like there's other areas I wanted to work on more later, and I just wanted to move on at the moment. What I'll do is go ahead and stamp that. I'm going to hold down the Control, the Alt, the Shift, and hit the E key. If you're on a Mac, that's going to be the Command, Option, Shift, E key. And that creates a stamp of any of the visible layers, right? So I've just stamped those layers together, and basically everything's right there in one layer. And we can compare, by turning that layer on and off, we can see what we've done with this photo thus far. What I'm going to do next is just do a little bit of the diffuse light that I had on here and make the contrast a little bit better. If we look at the levels, as I mentioned, we're not really having a true sort of light or true dark in here, and I don't know that I want a true white. I think it sort of makes it a little bit too bright in some areas, although a little improved contrast might work with this image. So I'm going to do that though through some blend modes instead. So I'm going to go ahead and make a duplicate of this to have a stamped copy, and this stamped copy I'm going to actually blur this image out. So I'll just say that that one's going to be the blurred version. We'll go into the filter effects. Again, I'm going to use Gaussian blur and have some level of blur on this, maybe not quite that much, 11 or so. There we go. I'll blur that out, and then I'll apply that back with some soft light. So we'll apply that over to this, and we're going to get this real sort of softer light effect. We can sort of see what's happening with this and it's really kind of, we're losing some of our sense of texture as well when I do this. As I apply that, and this is really overdone. I wanted just a little bit of that light, so I'm going to mitigate the effect by taking the opacity down somewhat, and we can see the increased contrast and a little softer light that we could create through that blend mode as well, as a way of adding some contrast or maybe softening the light just a little bit, as we do this. So I might play with that just a bit. Another thing that we could certainly do, I'm going to go ahead and stamp this again and have another version of it. I'm going to Control-Alt-E stamp, and we'll have our sort of merged version again from those other features. Let's explore this just a little bit more. We could do a couple other things with this image. You know, I might want to, I feel like it's shot in a very kind of cold environment. There's a lot of sort of blue in here. You know, like sometimes if you auto color something, you can see where Photoshop wants to push it, and it's going to make it way too orange when I do that. But part of the reason it went that way is simply because it was such a cool photograph. Like the skin tones and the tones were so cool, and it feels a little cold perhaps. Now, I don't want to go that far. I don't want to go to auto color. But what I might want to do is, you know, add a little bit different lighting, maybe a little more warmth to this as well. And one of the things that I might do is add that warmth more in the highlights and less in the shadows. Sometimes, like if I add some warmth to the highlights, you really want the opposite in the shadows. Like you want cool in the shadows. Like if we're casting this, you know, with light, and the warm light hits one place where it will be cooler underneath. And so we can actually play with this where we differentiate the light versus the shadow and explore that with our apply image feature, because that can be applied to layer masks as well. So what I'm going to do is create a layer mask on this image. I'll say add layer mask. There's nothing in it, and what I want to put in it is actually the image itself, but in black and white. We could do that by having the layer mask selected. I'm going to go to image, apply image here, and what we'll do is we'll choose just a merged version, which is, you know, the layers merged. That's fine. Rather than saying subtract, I'm just going to choose normal, and you'll see that inside of the thumbnail we're getting a black and white version of this particular image, and I can click OK and take a look at that. If we want to just see the black and white version of the mask here, I'm going to go ahead and look at that by itself. And in this case, the mask itself, what I might do is it's a black and white version of this, but I might up the contrast of that. So what I'm going to do is simply go into the levels for this image and actually punch up the levels of the black and white version of the mask, so that's a little bit more direct here. So I'm going to bring this in, and anything in black will sort of be masked out in this case, and then anything in white will show through. And so I can push this around and really just focus more on the highlight points to warm those up a little bit more. So I'm going to go ahead and do that right there. And then for this particular image, now that I'm coming back to that, by the way, we're actually seeing content below. So in this case, the mask is really showing us some of the imagery that's below. What I might want to do with this is simply create a color balance slider, and that's going to go on top here, and you'll see that this is affecting kind of everything, right? So what I might want to do is sort of warm this up, but it's affecting everything. But if I take this mask and I duplicate it onto that color balance slider, which I could have done already, I'm going to replace the mask that was there. I actually don't need this other mask anymore. I'll get rid of it. I really wanted it on the color balance slider. I'm going to delete it there. So now I've got that mask on the color balance slider, and what this is allowing us to do is add red, but we're only adding it in the kind of in the highlights, right? Not in the shadows. So I'm not really affecting some of the other cool colors that are there. We're only sort of making the red kind of go into the highlights here, and we're just going to warm up the skin tone just a little bit right here. I don't want to overdo it, but we can take a look at the effect of that, warming up the image just a little bit right there. And we can also take a look at the effect that the mask is having with that. So if I take off that mask, you see that the image overall gets very red, but I think it's a little more realistic to keep that more in the highlights where the warmth of the sun or the light is showing there. So if we do that overall, I don't really like all the red that's there. Worked a little bit better with our image in terms of warming or cooling this, right, where we're doing it just in the skin tones. So I might sort of add a little red. I could add some yellow to it or whatever if I wanted to warm it up. I just really want a little bit of additional red in here. I don't really want to overdo it or change the lighting that much, but I'm going to warm up this image just a little bit that way. So that's another sort of effect that we can use with the image apply image, is that you could take the current image and put it into a mask, for example, and then use that mask to apply lighting effects. In theory, I could also have an inverted version of this. Like if we go to that particular mask and we invert it, then all of the reds are in the dark areas now. We've switched this over and we're adding red to all of the sort of darker areas and not the lighter areas. That looks a little bit weird in this case, but I could cool the dark areas and warm the light areas, for example. So we could do this differentially. All right, I'll come back and apply that. The other thing, of course, in some of these glamour shots, people will apply digital makeup to things. And so I might do just one more little stamp on this. Oh, I don't really need to. Let's just go ahead and apply something else. I'm going to go ahead and say that I want some hue saturation adjustment. And what I'll do is just add some saturation overall. And we can see that as I add this saturation, it's applying everywhere. Well, maybe what I wanted to do was just make the lips a little redder, like there's a little more blood there, a little more lipstick there, and I want to kind of keep the realism of the color. I could certainly paint on there and just change the color as well, or we could change the hue of what color the lipstick was on there, so I could play with this as well. But let's just up the color a bit. I'm going to make it a little more dramatic so we can really see it. And then what we'll do is inside of the mask here of hue saturation, I'm going to first just fill that with black, meaning that we're not applying that anywhere. Then we'll go to our brush, switch to light, or hit X on your keyboard to cycle the foreground and background colors. And we could zoom in on the lips with a nice soft paintbrush. What we could do is we could paint in that color back. So we'll add that saturation sort of back right now onto the lips to make the lips a little bit more saturated in this particular case. And I could be very careful about where I'm applying this. If I overdo it and I get in some area up here, then I'll hit X and take that away, right? So we can switch colors here, and in terms of the foreground background color, and just adjust our mask to be perfectly kind of where we want that color applying itself. And so we wanted it through this area here to have just a little bit more color on the lips themselves. And I can sort of zoom out and see what we're getting. Now, I feel like I've overdone that lipstick because I had such additional saturation there. So I can bring that down. Like if we had none of it, this would be at 0. We could see what that would look like with no changes at all. And then we could slowly bring that up. If we wanted just a little bit more red in the lips, we could bring that up and add a little more blood, add a little more lipstick to the sense of the lips right there. So a kind of way of doing some digital makeup in some ways. And if I wanted to, we could even change the color of that. So maybe we wanted more of a pinker lipstick there, or some other color on the lips. We could certainly do that, where we can manipulate the look of the color that was being applied there as well. So I could play around with that to get these effects. People will change your eye color by painting on there and things like that as part of digital makeup as well. But let's take a look at the sort of before and after of our effects. There was the before image, and here is our sort of after image that we're trying to prepare for the magazine. In the end, sometimes, I might take all of this stuff and do a stamp. I'm going to say Control Alt Shift E and stamp. I'll turn off all of these other layers. This was kind of my final version right here. But sometimes I feel like I've overdone it. I do think that the key to Photoshop is subtlety, and sometimes if you kind of pushed it a little too far, you might go, gosh, I'm losing some of the realism of that real photo. And even though, some of those effects might be great, maybe it's a little too much. Well, you can always mitigate your effects too. Like I could take the opacity of that particular layer down, revealing that original background, and I could say, really, let's just do 50% of what I did. And we could see that, 50% of that pushes it just a little bit further, but keep some of that original realism there. And so depending on how far we want to bring this stuff, we could certainly do that. Maybe I just say, hey, I want 80% of what I've done, and I like that, where we keep some of that realism and yet we push it just a little bit further into this space. So there you go, a little bit about using image apply image, doing some frequency separation, and how you might do some more advanced skin retouching and tonal correction for your photographs.